August woke the big house like a bruise coming up under skin. Violet shadows along the gallery, a copper warmth in the kitchen where the first kettle began to mutter on the stove. Zelly moved through that hush the way a river slips past cypress knees, silent, patient, knowing every snag in the current. The china rattled faintly as she nested saucers on a tray, one thumb pressed to the blue willow pattern to keep it from singing out and betraying her. The garden beyond the scullery window was a seam of darkness cut with milkweed, monkshood, and belladonna that most folks called nightshade and crossed themselves at the sight of. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow I have a special story for you. The master liked to brag the garden belonged to his wife, but it was Zelly who kept it alive, pinching suckers from the tomatoes, staking beans, and letting certain plants go wild behind the fig tree where no one but the night knew their names. The house ran on her hands and pretended it didn't. That was the trick of places like Caldwell Parish. Everything they needed came from the people they refused to see. Steam licked the underside of the kettle lid. She folded a cloth twice, then twice more until the heat could rest in her palm without burning, and tipped the water to wake the leaves. Darjeeling for Mr. Walton, because he fancied himself a gentleman of the world. Thin tea that smelled like hay and stones. The belladonna tincture lived in a small brown bottle inside the false bottom of the flour bin, cork tight as a fist. A single drop made a mouth go dry and vision soften at the edges. 2 stole a man's steadiness. 3, she did not use 3. "Is that kettle for me or the angels?" Old Ruth's voice came like a scrape of willow on the house siding, dry and amused. "For him," Zelly said, without looking back. "Angels know to fetch their own." Ruth's laugh was soft, a hollow gourd with seeds inside. The old woman stirred ash down the stove's throat and set another log to burn. "Then let him drink his fine leaves." A pause, as if she were watching Zelly's shoulders, the careful way the girl's wrist tipped the little bottle, the invisible wetness that threaded into the tea like a hair. "Mind your count." Always. The first time had been a test, to see if the stories she'd read were true. The pages in Madame Hélène's herbarium, French words that leaned like drunkards until she trained her mouth to hold them steady. With Ruth's help, she'd pressed the nightshade berries between cloth, cooked them down, boiled them with wine till the liquid went the color of old violets, then left it in the sun to thicken and the moon to remember. A single drop. For days after, the master had blamed the heat for his headaches. When he fumbled a paperweight and cursed it for jumping, he laughed at himself and called for more tea. That was the way this had to be. Not a bolt of lightning from heaven, but a storm the man would walk into without ever thinking to look up. She carried the tray down the hall where portraits watched her with their oil-slick eyes, men in dark coats and women whose hands looked like the pale, folded wings of egrets. The runner was new, red as a crushed pomegranate, and swallowed her steps. At the study door she paused, made her face the cloth she wore when she needed to be no one at all, and knocked. "Enter," came his voice, already sharp. Mr. Walton sat behind a fortress of ledgers. Sunlight bled around the shutters in thin coins, all of it falling before it reached him. He'd been drinking his coffee black these last months, then switched to tea when the headaches began. Doctor's orders. And wasn't it a mercy the doctor's daughter had taught her letters by the kitchen hearth before the fever took the child? Zelly set the tray where the green leather wasn't scuffed and poured. Tea made a small river between cup and spout, a sound she had come to love, a promise of steady hands. He didn't look at her, only at the papers that smelled of dust and ink and someone else's life. "See that the luncheon is simple. The sheriff's coming by." "Yes, sir." Sheriff Attaway came when goods went missing, or when men in gray needed fresh horses, or when Mr. Walton wanted the house to know the law was a friend who knocked first. He took the cup without thanks, sipped.
blinked, slow as a cow in a storm. Better. That French must have taught you something. Only how to count sugar, sir. He grunted at his joke, and she slipped out, letting the door catch her reflection for one heartbeat. Brown face, a scar along the right temple where a careless boy had thrown a bone long ago, mouth that did not advertise what it knew. She moved back to the kitchen with the calm of someone who had placed a letter in the post and would not see it delivered for weeks. Ruth had taken up her stool by the door. In the light, the old woman's eyes looked like river stones, dark, polished by years. He drink? Drink. He'll have the trembles by noon. And you? What about me? Your trembles. Ruth's mouth made a knowing shape. Your hand's steady enough, but your heart's still a drum. I hear it. I hear it most when I pass the nursery and see the empty cradle where there should have been a baby, when I step in the pantry and count jars like rosary beads, each mark another day of patience, when the dogs outside lift their heads and decide I am not worth announcing. I hear it when I think how a drop is a mercy compared to what he would give us if he could. The morning sprawled into its usual errands, polishing the silver, boiling eggs, standing in the larder cool as a church, and planning how to turn yesterday's ham bone and today's beans into something that could be called a meal. The house breathed and clicked. Black dresses walked past like shadows. Phyllis with the laundry, Ellen with the child's shoes, Joe with a bucket of water so full it made the floor shine over his footprints. In the back gallery, the young mistress practiced the piano, scales that made forgiveness sound like a ladder to nowhere. By noon, the master sent for more tea and a cloth for his eyes. Zélie went with both. The second cup was only leaves and water. A man on a river learns how to lean without falling. So did she learn when to give and when to withhold. He pressed the damp cloth to his brow and lay back like a patient saint in a painting. Those saints did not count prophets while they prayed. "Close the shutters," he said. "This light gnaws." She closed them. The room went to cool green. For a moment, the hush was almost human. "Tell Ruth I'll eat in my study," and made a mark in the ledger next to a name that was not a number, but would become one when the right buyer came. She watched his hand while he wrote, a pale animal with a gold ring on it. The knuckle hair lay flat and obedient. He coughed, and the cough seemed to come from the room itself rather than the man. Zélie left before he could send her on some errand that required her to stand close enough to smell the oils in his skin. The day sagged. She filled it with usefulness. There were strawberries to hull and slice, their hearts a red that would stain. There was a dress to mend for the mistress, a rip along the hem like a smile that knew a secret. Ruth napped, mouth open. When she woke, she said, "You go to the garden at 4. That's light." "I know." "Don't look like you know," Ruth said, teasing. "Look like clean up." So Zélie took a broom and a basket and went out by the side path where no one of consequence walked because the white camellias had grown leggy and the bees paid too much mind. In the corner behind the fig, where children were warned not to play for fear of snakes, the belladonna held its own kingdom. Purple flowers drooped like little theater curtains. The berries, when they came, looked like the eyes of dolls. She bent and touched the leaves the way a seamstress handles silk. No one stood at the windows. No one cared to watch a girl coax a plant. It wasn't just for him. This morning medicine had a larger patient, a house, a parish, a fear with a government to it. Men in uniforms liked to sit at this table and talk about winning, while boys on the quarter whittled wood they'd never be allowed to call theirs. The doctor's books said the ancients named the plant for beauty and death both, that Roman ladies used to dilate their pupils with it to make their eyes look like black moons. Zélie smiled to herself. Let him stumble over his figures. Let his handwriting run like ink in rain. Every morning like this was a stone she laid across a river she meant to cross alive. When she returned, the sheriff's horse stood hitched at the rail, blowing. Sheriff Attaway's hat lay on the hall table like a sleeping animal. Voices came from the study. A man who had never gone hungry discussing hunger with another man who thought hunger improved the soul. Zélie took the luncheon tray, cold ham, biscuits, early figs, and a pot of mustard that bit the back of the throat. She delivered it without being called. She left the tea for last. The sheriff smiled at her, all teeth. "Your cook keeps a clean table," he said to Walton. "You're blessed." "I pay for blessings." "Poor girl." She poured. No drops. The tincture remained asleep in the kitchen. She carried the scent of the garden in her sleeves anyway. Sometimes it felt like that smell was a language only the two of them spoke. "You hear about the runaway downriver?" the sheriff asked, tearing a biscuit so neatly it looked surgical. "Took a good horse. Took a woman, too."
Walton's jaw twitched. "People need to learn which way is north," he said. "It isn't that." "True enough," Attaway said. "But I tell you what, I'm seeing a sickness round here." He looked at Zélie the way a man looks past a tree to see if there's shade beyond it. "First headaches, then fevers, then a kind of wandering in the head. It ain't the ague. The doctor says it ain't the river neither." He popped the biscuit in his mouth and chewed, eyes on nothing, as if a thought were moving through him like a fish. "And the doctor's wrong," Walton said, and reached for his cup with a hand that shook, just enough to rattle the saucer. Attaway saw it. "You ain't sick, are you, Thomas?" "Sick of you is what," Walton said lightly, and sipped. His throat worked. 1, 2. "Tell me you found the Carter boy." They drifted into men's talk, slow, mean, dull with certainty. Zélie stood with her hands folded, looking at the tray with a politeness that hid arithmetic. She could spill mustard on the sheriff's boot. She could slip and let the tea wet the ledger. She could do 100 small wickednesses that would make no meaning in the world. Or she could go and write a sentence in another language entirely. "Go," Walton said finally. "We'll call if we need more." In the passage, Ruth was waiting as if the shadows had told her something. He shook. "A little. Sheriff's seen it. The lawman's seen trembles on plenty of folk. He won't think fine enough to think of leaves." Ruth touched Zélie's cheek with 2 fingers, a benediction shaped like quickness. "Tomorrow you give him 1 drop again. Patience is a horse that don't get tired." "I know," Zélie said. But that night, when the house closed its eyes and the frogs took up their hymn, she lay awake on her pallet, listening to the mistress cough upstairs, thin, theatrical sounds, emphasis in all the wrong places, and wondered how many more mornings patience could hold. The world turned over once, twice. The next day began with thunder far away, the kind that stirs the dogs in their chains. The master sent word to wake him early. He wanted to ride the bottom fields before the heat. She steeped leaves, counted to 60 by heartbeats, added a drop like a prayer no church would recognize, and brought it in on the same blue willow saucer. He had a new ledger open. His eyes were dilated in a way that would have been beautiful on a painting, but looked frightened on a living face. Set it there. He reached and missed the handle, then covered his mistake with a little flourish, a gentleman crook of a wrist. She watched the cup reach his mouth. Somewhere outside, a mockingbird practiced another bird's song. Mrs. Walton walked in without knocking, and the room became smaller by half. She wore dove gray and a mouth the color of plums, and if you looked at her quick, you might have thought softness had found a body to live in. "Thomas," she said, "I am taking Ellen to town. We need ribbons." She noticed Zelie and chose not to notice her, the way you choose not to see a nail in a stair until it bites. "Buy 2, he said, "and bring back the doctor's powder." She smiled, a curtaining of teeth. "Your nerves?" "My patience," he said, and she laughed like a song you can't quite remember. After they left, he tried to stand and could not without making it an argument. A spasm passed through him like someone pulling a sheet under his skin. He took a breath, slow, deliberate, and his mouth shaped a word that could have been God or could have been numbers. He did not look at her while he lost the step. That was the keenest mercy he had ever shown Zelie. By afternoon, he had recovered enough to shout about a miscount in the tally of barrels. Men moved because his anger reached like a hand. The sheriff returned with a man Zelie had never seen. Narrow face, pale lashes, the doctor's bag in his hand. "A specialist," Attaway said, "from Natchez." The man watched Walton walk from desk to decanter and back, and made notes without writing, the pen of his mind scratching at air. He smelled like winter and vinegar. "Tea?" he asked casually, as if addressing the room itself. "Pour," Walton said, waving at Zelie with the carelessness of a man pointing out a hill in the distance. She poured. She felt the doctor's gaze like a thumb on her neck. The room held its breath. Steam climbed the space between lip and cup, trembled, broke. "Does anyone else in the house take tea?" he asked, still casually. "The ladies," Walton said. "The girl brings it." The doctor hummed. "These headaches, they come in the morning?"
"Worse by noon," Walton said. "Better in the evening." "Interesting." The man turned to Zelie, as if he had just noticed a window. "Do you drink tea as well?" "I drink water," she said. Her mouth had gone dry with a sudden pure honesty she did not trust. "Sometimes coffee, if there's to spare." He smiled without kindness. "You brew this yourself?" "Yes, sir." "What leaves?" She told him. He nodded and reached for the cup Walton had not yet lifted. "If you permit." He tipped it to his lip and wet the rim, held it in his mouth like a word he was tasting for meaning. Then he swallowed, gently, like a man finishing a prayer he had no faith in. Astringent. He did not die. He did not even cough. He set the cup down. Zelie saw Ruth at the door, watching with a face that contained a whole lifetime of ifs. "Bring me some water," the doctor said, still not looking at her. "Cool." She went. At the pump, the handle sang in her hand, a long iron note. She filled the dipper and thought of the bottle tucked in flour and the distance between a drop and a flood. When she came back, the doctor was examining the garden from the window. "You keep deadly nightshade here," he said, conversationally, as though pointing out an unpainted fence. "Belladonna. Do you know it?" Walton frowned. "The Frenchwoman's garden. Helene. She had a book." Zelie stood very still with the dipper in her hand. The doctor turned. "It's a fashionable plant among the old country ladies. Dangerous, of course." He let the word sit. "But beautiful." Walton snorted. "Pretty poison. I've seen worse in men." He took the cup again. His hand steadied just to spite them all. "What do you reckon?" "A nervous complaint. Overwork. Perhaps a tonic. Less coffee." His gaze flicked across Zelie once more and moved on. A knife, deciding a throat, wasn't worth the trouble. Sheriff Attaway looked disappointed, the way boys look when the river runs low. "I told you so," he said, anyway. Night came with stories like it always did. The quarter leaned in close to its own whispering, and Zelie listened from the back steps where the damp rose to her knees. Joe had a harmonica and could make it sound like hunger being reasonable. Phyllis had a way with children that made them believe bedtime belonged to them. Ruth told no stories aloud, but her quiet said one all the same. "I could stop," Zelia said, surprising herself. "You won't," Ruth said. "Not while the ledger has more names than Mercy. What if the doctor looks again? Then you'll be water where he expects tea. You'll be wind where he wants walls. You'll be here when he leaves, and that'll be enough to carry you to morning." The next day dawned mean and bright. Walton wanted to see the accounts. He wanted to inspect the smokehouse because he had dreamed of rats. He wanted his tea early and then late, and then not at all when the sheriff arrived with men who had the look of those who enjoy being told where to point their curiosity. In the kitchen, Ellen whispered that the mistress had asked the doctor for women's powders. In the yard, two boys argued over a slingshot. In the garden, a swallowtail butterfly went mad for the monk's hood. The world held steady, and inside that steadiness, a decision she had been walking toward for months stood waiting. She brought the tray at 10. 1 drop. She brought it again at 1. None. He waved her away, then called her back. He had begun to fear the tremble itself, not what it meant. At 3, the sheriff was shouting in the yard about a misplaced mule, as if a mule could misplace itself. In the study, the doctor from Natchez had returned uninvited and was peering through the shutters like a parishioner who suspects the preacher is hiding wine. "It is an odd thing," he murmured, "how the morning worsens him and the evening puts him right. Say what you came to say," Walton snapped. The doctor inclined his head as if accepting applause. "Stop the tea for a week." Silence fell so cleanly you could have cut cloth on it. Zelia felt the world pivot, a small adjustment like a seam turned on itself. "Tea is a pleasure," Walton said, "not a vice. Pleasures become vices when they own you. Try. If you falter, you've had your answer." He picked up his hat. "Good day." In the hall, Ruth's face broke in two, pain and pride. "He'll do it," she said. "Stubborn men like to prove the world wrong." "What do I do?" Zelia asked, though she already knew. "You cook his supper, you bring him water, and you wait." Evening came sugary with crickets. Walton lasted until sundown before he called for tea like a thirsty child calls for rain. "A small pot," he said, "for comfort." His voice tried to be careless and failed. He paced while she brewed, his heels making the floorboards remember every step they had ever had to hold. She carried the tray in with both hands, the weight of it truer than any oath she could make. She had not slept the night before, and the edges of things were too sharp. She set the cup down, and with a movement so clean even she didn't see it happen, she reached for the bottle in her apron pocket. It wasn't the belladonna. It was the antidote she had been saving for herself and Ruth in case the river rose too fast, a concoction of charcoal and milk and prayer. She touched the bottle with her fingertips and left it there. Not tonight. Walton drank. The room waited with him. When he finished, he exhaled like a man who had set down a load he had been pretending wasn't heavy. "Now there," he said. "Better." His hand steadied, his mouth relaxed. He smiled, a child's smile wearing a man's teeth, and for an awful backwards heartbeat, Zelia felt pity like a thorn in her heel. "Girl," he said suddenly, "how long have you been in this house?" 3 years. "Feels longer." He looked at her as if trying to place where in his system she belonged. "You're good with plants." "Yes, sir." "My wife's garden thrives. Tell her to start a new plot behind the smokehouse. Shade suits some things." He yawned and stood. "I'll rest." He took 2 steps and swayed back the space between them, catching himself on the edge of the desk, and laughed as if his body had just told him a joke. In the hall, Ruth was waiting. "You let him have it?" "1," she said. "He'll shake when he wakes." then sleep when he sleeps. We're close to the place where a road becomes a bridge. But the house had plans for wakefulness. Near midnight, the dogs exploded into sound. Men's voices answered, too many, too loud. Boots struck the gallery boards. Someone hammered the knocker like they meant to drive it through the wood. Ruth's eyes went thin. "Hide the bottle," she whispered. Zellier ran for the kitchen, pulled the flour bin, found the false bottom. The little brown bottle lay warm from the day's heat. She had never loved and hated a thing so much. She pushed it deeper, beyond flour, beyond wood, into the space where fear goes when a person decides it won't run the show anymore.
When she turned, Sheriff Attaway filled the doorway. Behind him stood 2 deputies and the doctor from Natchez, hat in hand, eyes bright with a solution he had finally learned to pronounce. "Evening," the sheriff said, voice sticky with triumph. "We'll be needing to see your tea things, miss." Ruth stepped forward, small and solid as a gatepost. "The master's sleepin'." "Then best we don't wake 'em," Attaway said. "We'll do our lookin' now." The deputies shouldered past. The doctor drifted behind like fog. Zelie stood between them and the bin and felt the shape of her body become a question the room had to answer. She could hear Walton upstairs turning in his sleep, Sheets sighing. She could hear her own breath, counting, not praying. The doctor reached for the flour bin. "Start with the simplest places," he said mildly. "Poison hides in ordinary jars." Zelie stepped left, then right, as if considering room for him that did not exist. "Flour," she said. "Nothing for you there." "That's what makes it interesting," he said, and set his hand to the lid. The house listened, the way a field listens for rain. He lifted. Flour rose in a pale cloud. The doctor coughed. The sheriff laughed. Ruth's hand found Zelie's wrist for one hard second, a clasp, a bell. Under the lid, white drifted like a slow snowfall across wood. Zelie saw the false bottom seam print itself in the sifting powder like the faintest scar. The doctor smiled, very small, and set his fingers to the edge of the false board. "There we are," he murmured. Zelie did not think. She moved. Her elbow knocked the dipper into the stove's open mouth. Fire leapt like a colt jumps a fence. Ruth cried out, anger, not fear, and grabbed for the wet rag, smothering flame to embers, smoke to steam. The deputy swore and stumbled back. The sheriff slapped at his coat. The doctor jerked his hand away from the bin, eyes watering, attention suddenly full of smoke instead of secrets. Zelie did not waste the heartbeat. Her fingers found the seam, the bottle, the cool smoothness of what could ruin her and everyone she loved, and slid it into the hollow of the stove's side, where ash had made a little cave. When the steam cleared, the kitchen looked like a girl who had just wiped tears from her face and pretended she hadn't. "Clumsy," the sheriff said, irritated now. "Fetch water." "It's fetched," Ruth said, and lifted the bucket with more dignity than the whole room deserved. The doctor, coughing, attempted a smile that admitted nothing and promised everything. He said hoarsely, "Another time. We'll look again in daylight." He glanced at the bin one more time, then at Zelie as if he were pinning a moth to a page. "Morning tea, then." He meant, "I will come at dawn." Zelie heard the words as if he had poured them into her ear. When they left, the house sagged with the quiet that comes after visitors who never bring a blessing. Ruth pressed both palms to Zelie's cheeks and held her there until the girl's breath remembered how to be slower than fear. "Listen to me," she said. "You 2 roads at sunup. One takes you past the river with Joe's boat. The other goes straight through that study and sets a cup down that will finish the work you started. You choose before the bell rings. Hear?" Zelie nodded. She could see both roads as if the house had unfolded them on the floor like maps. The black ribbon of river, the silver thread of steam. Her hands had never felt so steady. Her heart had never felt like a door.
Dawn would test the hinges. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. They voted, the runner panted, cheeks windburned from the dash up mane, tie crooked like he'd argued with it and lost. He gulped air, lifted a paper above his head like a flag, and finished in a voice that split the parking lot clean in two. 4-3. To relocate the library. They're selling the building to Harrow Development. Effective pending inspection filings. The word pending fluttered like a wounded bird and then died on the asphalt. Engines idled into silence as if a single hand had found a master switch. Mireya felt her throat attempt to swallow around a fist. The blue sleeve with approved in her hand did not become heavier. The world around it did. She raised the notice high. Approved for occupancy, she said, not shouting so much as laying a sentence on the crowd like lumber they could step on without falling. Open doors. Today. Harrow smiled as though he'd invented gravity and she had just confirmed it. You heard the man, he said to Reeves, who was sweating like a truth in summer. Paperwork's in order. We can move quick. We're open, Mireya said. She turned, slid the key into the lock with hands she had to remind into being hands, and pulled the door wide. Air moved through the lobby as if it had been waiting for the invitation. She stood aside. A woman with a stroller crossed the threshold first, her face a study in private decisions. A teenager followed, backpack slung like a shield. The chessmen hugged their board to their chests and shuffled in with dignity. The room received them, as it had every day it had been allowed to, like a lung receiving air. Cute, Harrow said, too loud for a man too convinced. A farewell tour. Rose stepped forward with a calm that suggested Rivers had learned to mind themselves when she was staring. Nobody's touring, she said. We're home. The cheer that rose wasn't a sound so much as a weather. It gathered, it climbed brick and soaked into mortar, and ran along the new railing into Mireya's bones. She felt her knees attempt to tremble, told them they could do that later. Reeves waggled papers like he could fan the moment out. There will be a transition plan, he said, words arranged like respectable furniture. A new facility with modern amenities, parking, activation nodes. Kids walk here after school, Mireya said, not taking her eyes off him, lifting the blue sleeve again. Approved for occupancy. Today. We're open. Sheriff Lowry chose the middle of the crowd with the accuracy of a man who's broken up fights without raising his voice. He tipped his hat, considered the physics of the day, and said, Nobody blocks fire lanes. Nobody puts hands on anybody. We're a town. Act like a decent one. His gaze moved to Mireya only long enough to pass a small nod that tasted like water to a thirsty thing. Cal drifted to her shoulder, not touching, gravity without collision. They picked their story, he said, voice a low line hung for clothes not yet washed. We'll pick ours. What does ours look like? She asked, not because she needed a plan and a miracle, but because she needed a sentence that didn't assume miracles were someone else's department. He angled his chin toward the bikes. Like work, he said, loud, lawful, useful. He lifted 2 fingers to his lips and let a whistle float. One note, unshowy, a shepherd's call you trust before you've named why. Helmets turned, heads nodded, the crowd found its edges. Inside, the library remembered its choreography, children's voices underlining the walls, the copier's baritone, and the soft footfalls of people learning to belong. Outside, Ro began making lists with her carpenter's pencil. Materials we can donate, she said, not to anyone in particular, but to the part of the air that makes things real when named. Tasks we can do without permits. Tasks we can propose by Friday if this town has the courage to accept a gift. Harrow laughed, the sound of ice cubes in a glass no one asked for. Gifts come with strings, he said. So do deals. Yours are just tied around other people's throats. Mireya watched the words hit, felt the crowd lean without tipping. She stepped forward, palms up, because hands carry more truth when they're empty. We will not be the town that sells its stories for a parking lot, she said, hearing the steadiness in her own voice like discovering a key in a pocket she hadn't known she had. We will be the town that builds more room for them. She turned to Ro. What does a new wing cost if labor is love? Ro squinted toward the rear lot, the rectangle of patchy grass where teens traded magic cards and old men traded lies about fish. Concrete, framing, electrical, sprinklers, fire-rated doors, accessibility code. It's not a weekend project, librarian. Nothing worth learning is. she said to herself, and to the room, and to the pieces of her father's voice that had taught her the dignity of stubbornness without handing her the tools for it. A murmur moved through the riders like wind through wheat. Phrases lifted and settled. I can source conduit. My cousin's a plumber, union, he'll sign on if it's clean. I've got a line on sheetrock. We can pre-cut rafters off-site. Names flew like birds whose wings knew which updrafts they could trust. Chapters were quietly mentioned, the kind town gossip would put in all caps later. Hell's Angels, pagans, free sons, and yet the conversation held no swagger, only the humility of work.
Cal caught her eye. We can put 120 on site by sunup if you say the word, he said. Not to posture, to build. We do it with permits or we don't do it. Sunup is before Friday, Maria said, calculating nights not in hours but in courage. She looked at Laurie. Sheriff? I'm not a building inspector, he said, but I know a lawful assembly when I see one. You get plans drawn by somebody with a stamp. You get an inspector willing to show up in the rain. You keep the site clean and the egress clear. I can call this community education. The corner of his mouth twitched, and I'll drink the bad coffee again. Maria turned to the crowd. We will present an alternative to the council on Friday. Keep this building, add a wing, paid for by donations and labor, inspected, up to code, owned by the town. If they listen, good. If they don't, we will remember who prefers activation nodes to children's feet on safe floors. She paused because the heart requires breath between sentences like these. We start now. Harold's smile tightened the way rope does right before it learns which neck it is around. You don't have authority to plan capital projects, he said. Public comment has authority. Petitions have authority. The smell of 1,000 people's first book has authority. She gestured to the circulation desk, to the bulletin board, to the thin crack in the ceiling they'd covered with the banner 8 summers running. Community has authority. You just don't recognize its letterhead. The library became a command center without becoming less a library. Rowe claimed the long table by the periodicals and unfurled graph paper like a river map. A rider in an old red cardigan, with patches so faded they looked like ghosts returned to help, introduced himself as Abel, retired fire marshal, and began quietly listing code requirements in a hand that announced patience without apology. A young woman in electrician's blues rolled out a spool of possibilities and began sketching runs on vellum like music. Cal vanished the way a man does when he becomes conduit. He returned with coffees he hadn't paid for because the cafe had sent them with a nod and a wave and put it on whoever believes in tomorrow. He circulated without boasting, translated Rowe's measurements into orders, translated orders into phone calls that began to arrive with the kind of punctuality hope rarely commands. Maria called the county clerk. She called the city planner. She called the inspector who had signed her blue sleeve 30 minutes earlier and asked him if he believed in second acts. He sighed the sigh of a man who had learned to be small inside bureaucracy so his heart could stay big enough for people. Bring me drawings, he said. Bring me a site plan. Bring me evidence you won't burn down a town with the best intentions I've seen all month. He lowered his voice. My sister teaches first grade. She sends kids here who need a place where quiet is not punishment. She texted the friends. Pot of chili, 10 loaves of bread, fruit, coffee. She did not type please because they had already decided what their answer would be. By dusk, the rear lot glowed under work lights the riders had strung with more care than Christmas. Rowe chalked a rectangle on gravel, 18 by 60, then widened it by 4 feet when she saw the picture book stacked against walls inside, like hope needing knees. If we do this, she told Maria, pencil behind her ear like a choice, we do it with room for legs and strollers and wheelchairs and the kind of space kids take up when they forget to make themselves small. Rainlight wing, someone said. Call it that. The word wing lifted on a draft made of 100 unremarkable good deeds and didn't come down. Sheriff Laurie set flares at the alley's mouth and otherwise became a neighbor in a uniform.
Abel, the retired fire marshal, walked the chalk lines with a tape measure and the frown of a man constructing safety 1 inch at a time. The inspector came back at 9 with a wool cap pulled over ears he'd never learned to trust against wind. He looked at the drawings Rowe had produced, at the volunteer list Abel had marshaled, at the material deliveries queued at the curb. "You understand," he said, voice professional while his eyes betrayed him to his better self. "I cannot sign off on concrete poured without forms inspected, rebar placed to spec, and a licensed electrician on every circuit." "We understand," Rowe said. "We also understand how to build a slab while the county sleeps, and to wait for you to wake up and check the rebar like it's a sonnet. We're not breaking laws here, sir. We're writing down a different set of options." He looked at Maria. "And you understand if a board member shows up with a camera and catches a volunteer on a ladder without fall protection, I become the villain who stops the good story? I understand that my job is to hand you a story you can sign," she said. He nodded once, a man pinning a small brave flag on his own uniform where nobody could order it removed. "Forms at dawn, rebar on my mark. Nobody falls off anything." He left to the kind of applause bureaucrats deserve more often. They worked until their breath turned to ghosts. Rowe set shifts. Riders who'd driven 4 hours unrolled sleeping bags under the stricter stare of the old genealogy portraits upstairs, and Maria found herself tucking a fleece around a teenager with purple hair who'd welded longer than most boys had been told to look tough. She wrote their names in a notebook, for the invoice no one would send, for the history someone would someday ask for. At 3 in the morning, when a person's doubts traditionally hire a band and dance on their ribs, Maria stood alone in the children's room and let her hand trail across thin volumes whose spines had outlived marriages and flood seasons. The building hummed different with sleeping strangers in it, not less safe, more so, like the kind of church that remembers its job is not to perform righteousness, but to shelter the wet. Cal found her there, because some men have developed a nose for where a thought gets stuck. He didn't speak until she looked at him. Then he didn't speak for a breath longer, gifting her the choice to be brave first. "If it all goes wrong, you're still the one who opened the door." "And if it goes right?" she asked. He considered that with unusual leisure, as if tasting a fruit everyone had told him doesn't grow here. "Then you'll spend the rest of your life surprised by how many people were waiting to be asked." She laughed, soft and unguarded enough that the sound surprised her. It sounded like the first page turning in a book you hadn't known you needed. She looked at his face and saw it at rest, without the careful angles it performed around authority. "Cal," she said, and then remembered that names are the smallest kinds of belonging we're allowed to offer in public. "When this is done, don't spend the end while you're in the mill," he said. He didn't touch her, and somehow that steadied her more than an embrace would have. "Pour the slab, 1 inch at a time." Dawn threw gray over the lot like primer. The forms stood true, square as apologies rarely are. The rebar grid looked like music. The inspector arrived with a thermos and stood with Abel, and the two men spoke in a dialect that produces buildings rather than speeches. "Pour," the inspector said, after one red pen correction and one reluctant smile at Rowe's framing schedule. Trucks backed in like whales finding a cove they'd chosen before remembering why. At 8, the first of the Hells Angels rolled in as a river rather than a wave. Steady, deep, the kind of presence that doesn't announce itself because it has already arrived. Patches caught light, helmets lifted. Faces looked like men who had learned the cost of power and were now choosing to spend it differently. They came from 2 states over and 3 counties sideways. The sound of 120 bikes dying into quiet felt like respect. News followed, as news does when it smells conflict and finds community instead. A local stringer from Channel 12 set up a tripod. A blogger with a newsletter titled The Fairy Ledger scribbled like his pen could redeem the sins of the internet. A woman with a mic asked Mariah to summarize the situation in 20 seconds or less. Mariah smiled, the smile women smile when asked to translate years of service into a soundbite. "We're building room for our town to be kinder," she said. "We're using the skills we have." Harrow arrived with an injunction written in a font so aggressive, even the commas looked violent. He thrust it toward Lowry, who read it slowly because knowing what you obey is part of how you stay on the right side of yourself. He handed it back. "This says you don't want me to let them build," the sheriff said, mildly. "It does not say I have to close a library whose occupancy is approved." Harrow's smile came unstitched. "You think this is about books?" "I think everything is," Mariah said. Work overtook argument the way rivers overtake mud. The slab became philosophy poured into place. Bystanders formed a chain for rebar, and then for bottles of water, and then for sandwiches. The dignity of repetition made something liturgical out of sweat. Framing rose like ribs on a new body learning how to breathe. Rowe walked the perimeter with a square, tapping uprights like a midwife ensuring a pulse. The electrician ran conduit with a dancer's economy of motion. A plumber, with forearms the size of loyalty, crawled beneath to set drains where children would someday wash paint off hands that had been busy making messes good enough to keep. Inside, the library remained itself. Story time met on the floor with windows open to the sound of saws, and toddlers chanted about a bear who discovered that building a den is easier with friends. The chessmen had moved their board to the margin of the action and debated defenses as if the rook's L could become a ramp. A teenage boy, Mateo, found his way to the makeshift shop and held a stud while an angel, who introduced himself as Grin, explained why 2 nails hold better than 1 if you angle them like trust. "Why Grin?" Mateo asked, deadpan, which was the right way to ask men with patches questions like that. "Because life tried to teach me to scowl," the man said, hammer pausing like a thought. "I chose otherwise." He added the second nail as if to prove it. By noon, the drain drew shadows on the old brick like new notes written beside a melody that wasn't changing so much as becoming itself louder. Harrow called the mayor called Reeves called the inspector. The inspector answered by sending a junior colleague with a checklist and a nervous smile. "We're rooting for you," the junior said under his breath, then cleared his throat and added in his official voice, "Please ensure all fasteners are rated per Spec 7804C. The afternoon stretched its arms. Muscles burned and blessed their owners. Handoffs became habit. Mariah moved from water station to sign-in sheet to teenage translator, and at some point she realized she had not checked how she looked in 5 hours and felt better in her skin for it. Cal appeared at the exact moments the weight in her hands needed redistributing. He said almost nothing. His presence built scaffolding inside her she hadn't known she lacked. At 4, a cloud bank marched in from the west carrying the kind of rain that humbles speeches. Hands quickened, tarps unfurled like baptismal gowns. "We stop if lightning," Rose said, to everyone and to the sky. Lightning thought about it and declined. Eli Harrow walked the perimeter with a phone glued to his ear and the expression of a man discovering that a town has more numbers than he owns. He stopped beside a cluster of angels tightening hurricane ties and tried again. "You people are outlaws," he said. One of the men looked up with the calm of a long road. "Today, I'm a volunteer. You?" Harrow opened his mouth and found the weather had better lines. By evening, the shell stood. It wasn't handsome yet, it was honest. That will do, Mariah thought, and then corrected herself. That is the point. They slept in shifts. They ate in shifts. A boy who feared this building would move past him beyond reach fell asleep under a table full of donated baked ziti, and a woman in leather draped her jacket over him like a treaty. Sheriff Lowry called in 2 deputies who spent the night not writing tickets they didn't need to and drinking coffee everyone swore was improving by the pot. Day 2 broke like a promise made by somebody who meant it. Sheathing, wrap, windows, a skylight over what would be the story corner that Rote argued for as if light were a civil right. "Kids deserve sky," she said, and the inspector initialed a line as if he had been waiting all month to do it. Cal carried a door in by himself because sometimes men who have carried their own mistakes for years find that oak is comparatively light. He set it in the frame and breathed as if weight had taught him a different dictionary. "Push or pull?" he asked Mariah, his hand on the blank metal where a handle would live. "Both," she said, surprising them both. He smiled like he had been given a better assignment halfway through a job and didn't mind. At noon, Reeves returned with a camera crew and the prissy bravery of men who arrive after the work is half done and try to narrate it. "We're proud to see our community engage," he said into the lens. "Of course, any final decision must be evidence-based," Mariah finished into the same microphone, "because women who hand you a library do not owe you their silence. Evidence, this wing meets code. Evidence, it costs the town nothing. Evidence, it keeps the library where children walk." She gestured behind her where a line of kids on break from camp had formed to bang 2 hammers into a ceremonial plank as if sound itself could vote. "We invite the council to accept the donation at tonight's session." Harrow tried to intercept the mic, the reporter shifted left, the camera stayed with the person not grimacing. Choices became visible. By late afternoon, the paint smell threatened to baptize them all into headaches. Someone opened all the windows, and the building inhaled like a swimmer breaking the surface. The sign, Rainlight Wing, arrived in the bed of a truck driven by Rose's cousin, who worked metal the way some men teach first grade, unshowy, exacting, better for having been loved. He set the letters on the new facade and stepped back. The crowd decided not to clap yet. It would have felt like interrupting a prayer. The inspector appeared at 5 with his clipboard and a look like a man who had built a treehouse for his kids and was about to allow the whole town to climb it. He checked exits. He checked the extinguisher cases, which 2 angels had installed with the precision of contrition. He ran a hand along the skylight frame as if testing a promise could hold water.
"Certificate of occupancy for the Rainlight Wing," he said finally, pulling papers free like a magician who earns his applause. "Effective immediately." The cheer that followed climbed the walls and dusted the portraits in the genealogy room and went out the windows to bother birds with joy. People cried the way you do when you've been pretending you didn't need to. Cal leaned against a post and watched Mariah accept the certificate with both hands, as if it were a child you don't drop. "Tonight's meeting," Rose said in Mariah's ear. "One more river to cross." They crossed it carrying everything they had learned. The council chamber looked smaller than it had 2 days ago, as if a room's size could shrink when its authority did. Harrow sat beside the mayor, confidence lacquered over something that had begun to chip. Reeves cleared his throat in a microphone that squealed its disagreement, then banged a gavel that sounded like a ruler slapped on a desk by a teacher who has lost the room. "Public comment," Reeves announced. "Voice-seeking purchase. 2 minutes each." People who had never asked for microphones lined up. A girl who read under her covers with a flashlight testified as if she were older than time. An angel with hands like maps said his first safe place had smelled like paper and Windex, and that no one had asked him to prove he deserved it. The retired fire marshal spoke in code paragraphs that ended in the same word, compliant. A mother explained how bus routes measure whether a town is telling the truth. Sheriff Lowry stepped to the mic and said he was here as a citizen and that he'd watched 120 men and women follow rules to build something the rules had not had the imagination to propose. Then Cal, who hated microphones the way some men hate mirrors, stepped up because there are moments when a person chooses discomfort as a way to be honest. He looked at the council and then at the room and then at the floor, which, disappointed him by offering no advice. "I don't live here. Not yet. But this place did me a kindness when it didn't have to. I've been around. A lot of towns would rather post a sign about what they're against than do work on what they're for. You've got people here who like building more than they like arguing. I used to be good at breaking things. I'd like to be remembered for something else." He stepped back before the part of him trained to expect contempt could start rehearsing. Maria went last because she had learned not to open debates she had to close. She set the certificate of occupancy on the lectern like a gospel. "We're not asking for money. We're giving you a wing. We're giving you a headline you can be proud of. Town keeps its library. And we're giving you the chance to be the kind of counsel people point to when they teach civics in 5th grade." She breathed once, a controlled burn against tears. "Accept the donation. Keep the library where kids can bike. Call this what it is, a community correcting the limits of a spreadsheet." Silence waited. It had learned patience these last 2 days. Reeves fiddled with his papers, as if they were an instrument he could tune into moral clarity. Harrow whispered in the mayor's ear and received a nod that wasn't the nod he wanted. Finally, Reeves said, "The motion on the floor is to accept donation of the so-called Rainlight Wing and to rescind prior motion to sell the building to Harrow Development pending legal review." He looked like a man pronouncing an unfamiliar benediction. They voted, 4-3, the opposite direction this time. The room exploded carefully, the sort of joy that knows nurses live upstairs and babies need sleeping. People hugged in the ways their bodies had been taught, which is to say, awkward and triumphant. Harrow stood, the smile gone a little haunted now. He extended a hand toward Maria as if shaking hers could undo it. She took it because refusing would have satisfied him too much. His grip contained metal and a warning. "You made an enemy," he said, voice-pitched for her alone. "No," she said, matching quiet for quiet. "I made a library bigger."
Outside, the bikers didn't roar. They rolled their bikes down the street like men afterward in church. Helmets bumped shoulders. Someone began humming, which is sometimes all victory asks. The dedication took place 2 days later because the printer needed time to make a ribbon long enough. The plaque on the wall read, "Rainlight Wing, built by the hands of Wilder Ferry, with love from 120 riders who remembered their first book." Names rolled under it in small letters Mireia traced with a finger when no one was looking. The mayor, who had a talent for appearing at the photo's edge of any success, made remarks about community. Reeves nodded at intervals that suggested he had hired a consultant for it. Rose said nothing in front of the microphone, which felt like an argument with God she'd already won. Abel, the retired fire marshal, pressed a copy of the signed permits into Mireia's hand, like a grandfather pressing a dollar into a palm in church. The inspector shook her hand twice. "You smell like paper and rain," he said, and grinned as if quoting had made him bold. Cal stood a little apart, as men who've been inside trouble tend to, unsure where to place his hands now that there was nothing obvious to lift. Kids clustered around the new low shelves as if they had invented both shelving and proximity. Mateo took his little sister by the hand and led her to the skylight. "Look," he said, as if showing someone the sky counted as authorship. Mireia found Cal when the speeches dwindled to crumbs. "You did this," she said, then corrected herself, because accuracy is the kind of love not enough towns practice. "You helped us remember we could." He ducked his head, the unfamiliarity of praise hitting him like weather he'd learned to ride through rather than fight. "You opened the door. We just walked in with tools." "Stay," she said, the word more reckless than any policy she had ever written. He looked at the wing, at the door, at the road that still tugged on him with the annoying fidelity of old habits. He looked at Roe, who watched him with a kindness his body did not know how to metabolize. "I can stay for a while," he said, and the while felt like a country large enough to move in without hitting old furniture. Evenings learned a different choreography. Cal took the volunteer slot nobody wanted, closing time, when the light goes melancholy and the building sighs into its bones. He tightened loose chair legs before they became metaphors. He taught teens how to change a plug without changing their eyebrows. He learned to shelve without swearing. He slept in the shelter 2 nights out of 7 and in his friend's garage the others until a small apartment above the hardware store, previously rented to a ghost, learned his name and agreed not to haunt him with bills he couldn't pay. Harrow sued because men like Harrow consider litigation a language. The town's pro bono lawyer filed responses with the weary elegance of someone who believes in the law even when it embarrasses itself. The judge, who had once been 8 and had walked to this very building to escape a house that found silence only during commercials, dismissed the emergency motion with a comment about the public interest that sounded like a lullaby disguised as case law. Not everything went clean. A week after the dedication, someone spray-painted "Go Back to California" on the alley wall, which was a bewildering insult given that nobody involved was from there. Riders scrubbed it off with the kind of patience men reserve for engines and children. 2 months later, a budget vote failed by a margin that suggested pettiness in a zip tie. The friends baked more pies and solved a shortfall with sugar and a raffle for a hand-built bookshelf that a welder donated after remembering his mother reading to him off a couch he hadn't admitted he'd missed. On the first rainy night of fall, a kid with a black eye arrived 10 minutes before closing. He hovered, scanning for trouble the way a deer scans for a path. Mireya waved him in. "My mom works late. Is it okay if I wait here?" "It's what this place was built for," she said, more truth in the sentence than she had realized her chest was carrying. Cal set a mug of tea on the table near the boy without making the kindness into something that owed him back. "You want me to walk you home later?" he asked, his voice shaped to fit the boy's size. "I'm not a kid," he said, then looked at the steam and added, "Maybe." He stayed until the rain softened to a sound a person could carry without spilling. Winter came in like a man who didn't understand how doors work. The wings stayed warm. The skylight collected snow and made the kind of light a child might recognize as a promise. People began donating little things, board games complete except for one pawn, quilts that had been shy for years, plants that refused to die because the library had decided on their behalf, and the place turned into something that wasn't just a building, it was a verb. On a Tuesday in February, a semi lost its mind on the highway and tipped, and the whole town showed up to be useful. Rowe organized a lane. Harrow, who was caught in his SUV behind the mess, climbed out and tried to organize a different lane. Reeves, who had a talent for appearing at the photo's edge of any success, made remarks about community. Cal, who had been a wrecking ball and now had an instinct for gentleness, coaxed a crying trucker onto a curb and told him a story about a man who had broken things for a living and had learned to build instead. The trucker stopped shaking sometime during Chapter 3. Spring brought the kind of rain that makes small towns remember where their roofs leak. The wing didn't. The old stacks did twice. A group of riders replaced shingles under Rowe's supervision and Laurie's board counsel. Harrow's development broke ground on a glass-fronted bakery 3 doors down, and because life loves irony, the bread was good. On the anniversary of the vote, the town held a little party that looked like an accident the way real parties do. Balloons nobody admitted to buying, lemonade nobody admitted to spiking, photos and frames that had been waiting in drawers for somebody to decide they mattered. Reeves posed with a hammer, as if convincing history he had always been on its better side. The judge who had dismissed Harrow's motion sent a note on stationery that smelled faintly of courage. Mireya stood at the edge of the wing and watched a kindergartner show her grandmother the skylight like she'd carved it herself. Cal leaned beside her with the easy gravity men develop when they realize they don't have to leave the second they are treated kindly. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't opened the door that night?" She said, "All the time. Then I stopped because I like this version of the story better." He nodded, and the nod contained the weight of a road choosing to fold itself into a place. Thunder congregated behind the hills, the friendly kind that announces summer before the calendar. People looked up and didn't flinch. A little boy pressed both hands to the new glass and shouted, "It's raining inside the sky!" And nobody corrected him, because he was right in the way that matters. Later, closing the doors on a day so full it knocked against the corners of her ribs, Mireya turned the key and felt the building settle. Cal lingered, checking the strike plate that no longer needed checking. They stood in the kind of quiet that isn't absence, but presence breathing. "You know I'm not always good at staying," he said, not quite apologizing, not asking for permission to be something he might not yet be. "I know, and I know you're better at it now." He smiled, the small private kind that people who have survived themselves learn. "I'm learning from a librarian." She laughed, and in the laugh was the first night's storm and the board's censure and the smell of wet leather in the lobby and the blue sleeve that had felt light in the hand and heavy everywhere else. "You're learning from a town," she said. They walked out together. The night revised the streetlight into something warmer. Engines from a late ride rolled by, unhurried, a hymn without words. Inside, the books stacked themselves patiently into tomorrow. 2 blocks away, Harrow looked through the bakery glass at the reflection of a library that stubbornly refused to sell its bones. He sipped coffee that had been roasted by a kid who did his homework under that skylight. He tried to hate the taste. It was good. He looked down at his phone at a new proposal draft blinking in an inbox labeled Next Moves, and closed the app because the road he'd always taken had developed a speed limit he didn't like. He didn't admit that he'd checked out a book there last week. When the rains came hard, as they will, the building held. People opened the door purposefully now when the weather was unkind. A biker in a stiff jacket set a blanket around a sleeping man's shoulders without making it a story. A woman who had once written letters to the editor about those people read to a toddler with curls shaped like commas and learned that commas save lives. One night, late, the lights went out in a thunder stumble. The emergency lamps winked on obediently, ran by a system Roe had insisted upon and Abel had triple-signed. In the dim, the wing glowed steady under its skylight black with weather. Mireya stood in the hush and felt the entire year sit down beside her and set its head on her shoulder like a friend who doesn't need new words to prove the old ones true. Cal's silhouette moved at the far door. He crossed to her and stopped at a respectful distance because some proximities are holy. "You good?" he asked. She listened to the rain learn its manners against the glass. She thought of the boy who had pressed his hands to the sky and the old men arguing like loyalists about whether a knight could in good conscience hop through a wall, and of rose pencil shaving curls that littered the plan table like a different kind of confetti. She thought of the smell of wet paper, which is not the tragedy people assume if the building is tended with love. "I am," she said, and realized it was true, not as an aspiration, but as a fact. The lights blinked back on, a practical miracle anyone could file paperwork for. Somewhere outside, a bike turned over and purred like a cat deciding to forgive. The door, newly hung, closed with its dignified punctuation. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.